Let's go ahead and begin. Welcome once again. My name is Naomi Washington Leapart. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Strategic Partnerships Director here at PRA, Political Research Associates. Um, we know that we probably have many friends on the line, folks who already know PRA. But for those of you who might be new to PRA, we are a social justice research and strategy center dedicated to blocking the advance of oppressive anti-democratic movements and to building a just and inclusive democratic society. Over the past 4 decades now, PRA has researched and monitored and publicized the agenda and the strategies of the US and global right. We reveal the powerful intersections of Christian nationalism, white nationalism, and patriarchy. And so we want to say to you right here, we invite you to be involved, and stay tuned with our work. You can write for us. We have a number of publications that you can write for. We can get connected to your organization. As the partnerships director, I'm excited to forge new relationships with movement building organizations across many sectors. And you can join us in our work by staying tuned to our newsletter. We don't spam you. We send you infrequent but chock full of helpful information, newsletters and emails to connect you and plug you into our work. This particular conversation we call regime change, what to expect and how to mobilize for the year ahead. As we continue to reflect on what the 2024 election results signal about the contemporary U.S. right and the landscape of contestation, this discussion is going to focus on how we on the social movement left are readying ourselves for an authoritarian Trump regime. What are the acute opportunities? What are the threats that exist in the near and longer term future? And what analytical and forward-looking clarity do we need to prepare for those opportunities and those threats? So I'm going to get right to it and introduce our panelists. And make one more kind of housekeeping announcement, and then we'll get started. By way of housekeeping, let me say, you can see that you have access to the chat. And so please feel free to engage in the chat. If you have a question for one of our panelists, please flag that for us in the in the chat box. And you can connect with us there. We've got folks behind the scenes monitoring the chat so that they can bring to my attention anything that you want to bring forward to the panelists. So our panelists today, first we have Makani Themba, who is the Chief Strategist at Higher Ground Change Strategies based in Jackson, Mississippi. She is a social justice innovator and pioneer in the field of change communications and narrative strategy. Makani has spent more than 20 years supporting organizations and coalitions and philanthropic institutions in developing high-impact change initiatives. You can just wave, Makani, so folks will know. Thank you so much. And then we've got Tenjiwe McCarris, who is an organizer who's played a role in building the movement for Black lives and is the co-founder of Blackbird, which is an organization that focuses on movement building in this current historical moment. She's also working with organizers around the world in hopes of establishing an international collective of leaders dedicated to international movement building. Tenji, you want to wave for us? Great. And then we have Stephen Gardner, who's my colleague at PRA. Stephen serves as Principal Research Advisor and formerly the Research Director here at PRA. And he's been researching and writing in opposition to the politics of bigotry, violence, and authoritarianism since the early 1990s. Stephen, you can give a wave if you want. Great. Before we get started in our conversation, I want to tell you about an event that we're having tomorrow. I'll remind us at the end of our conversation. As some of you probably know, our executive director, Tarso Ramos, is leaving PRA, and the PRA team would like to invite you to join us tomorrow, Wednesday, December 11th, from 5 to 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time online for Celebrating Tarso. This is a virtual commemoration of Tarso's 18-year legacy at PRA, including as our executive director. Tarso's last day with PRA will be at the end of the month, at the end of December 2024. So join us for this celebratory moment where we can honor and reflect on the legacy that Tarso leaves PRA. So that's tomorrow. And I think my colleagues will put the registration link in the chat for you all to register if you'd like to join us tomorrow. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm going to first turn to you, Stephen, to reflect on the results of the 2024 elections and what these results signal about our contemporary political and cultural moment. What do you think we should expect from the administration and the far right in the year or so to come?
Thank you, Naomi. And first of all, just let me say it is just an honor to be on today with Makania, with Tinjiwe. Wow, this is a great moment to have this conversation. Yeah, well, at PRA, we have a refrain, and it goes, you want to right size the threat. You want to inform your resistance. So once you identify the threat, you want to make sure that you actually know something about it before you start to do things which might not be very effective. But you also want to right size the threat. You don't want to make it bigger than it is so you scare yourself into submission. And you don't want to deny it so that you get blindsided over and over again. So we're looking at this regime change, and this is a great way to talk about this. We don't usually talk about US regimes. We usually talk about the regimes of some dictator somewhere. Well, it's actually a good phrase because it means more than just the president and his cronies. It means the set of ideas, and this is what the word regime means in sort of political science jargon. It means the set of ideas and jargon and norms and procedures and laws and all of the things that shape the way this administration is going to operate. So we know what the vote counts were. They were basically split. In the end, Trump gets less than 50% of the vote. The majorities in the Senate and the House are historically small. I mean, it's just a tiny majority. This is not some great mandate by any historical standards, and it's important to understand that. The question is actually about the consequences, because this is a regime that does not care, and it has made this publicly clear, it's not a secret, about how much democratic, in the small d democracy sense, support that it has. What it cares about is what can it get away with? What can it get away with? And so there are some key points here. The first is within the Trump world, within the regime, there are people from different perspectives. There are opportunists who are there because they think that they can get their pet project, their sort of libertarian tax cut or their deregulation regime. They can hitch it to Trump and it'll work. There are those who are pure grifters, who are simply sucking up to Trump to hope that they can raise their own their personal capital, in sort of both senses of that. They're how much money they're making and how highly regarded they are in the world, in the MAGA world. And then there are true believers in sort of the fascistic or authoritarian ideas that circulate in the MAGAverse around Donald Trump, of which he is by no means the author. And in some senses, he doesn't even always understand what they are, since he doesn't really care all that much. So the sort of a leading proponent of this would be Stephen America for Americans Miller, who is going to have a key role on the new staff. Uh, and what we have to contend with here is if their orientation is how do we get, instead of like a traditional administration in the United States, which is like, okay, what is our budget proposal going to be? Or what policies are we going to try to caucus with Congress to push through? Or what are some marginal things we can do with executive orders? Instead of that, it's what can we get away with, which means how can we discourage agencies that we don't like or that we would like to use for vaguely or unconstitutional purposes by putting people who are clearly unqualified and who are absolute loyalists and also absolutely dependent on the president, since they are clearly people who have difficulties in other parts of their lives. So how can we get those people into office? So this is the nominations for the cabinet positions. And this is also an attack on the institution of the Senate. Now, the Senate is not my favorite institution in the United States, but it has a constitutional duty to do a thing. And that's to say, yeah, this guy is not qualified, or this man or this woman or this nominee is not qualified for this position. They shouldn't be confirmed. Not qualified because of character, not qualified because of knowledge and skill and what have you, or not qualified because they have said things that are contrary to basic normative principles of democracy. Well, there's a whole bunch of those that are going to be hitting the Senate, and the Republican-dominated Senate, even though it's a small majority, is now going to be in the position in a hyper-partisan environment where they either have to blanket say no to a whole bunch of just awful nominees, which even many of them, if they were purely going with what they thought their duty was, that's what they would do. But if they do that, they're going to basically undermine the Trump administration from the get-go. And the Trump administration is their administration. They still identify with it. This is a profound, for those of them who are the Republicans on it, who are not in the MAGAverse, and there are some, this is a profound lack of political imagination about what could be coming at them. They're going to try to push the limits of what can be done with executive orders and dare the courts to stop them. And if they do try to stop them, to do the slightly tweaked executive order to do the same thing. And if that doesn't work, potentially to activate by a wink and a nod, as the way Trump has done in the past, civilian actors, vigilante actors, to go into intimidation or even violence mode and then be disavowed if necessary. But right-sizing the threat also means to understand that this mode of operating through chaos and confrontation and bullying and bumbling also has its limits. We shouldn't come to a foregone conclusion that they're going to be formidable in every single thing that they attempt to do. So, for example, with mass deportation, which is being promised, there is literally no way that any professional who has looked at this will say that they're going to be able to do what they said they're going to do in a way that would meet the expectations of their racist and anti-immigrant base, which would be to deport millions of people almost instantly. They don't have the logistics to do this. And they're going to be fighting with sort of understaffed bureaucracies and understaffed administrative immigration judges, and resistance from within the organizations and within the states. So, okay, what can they do? They may not be able to instantly deport millions of people, but they can create a spectacle of deportation where they rush in and grab people who are available, put it on television, put it on Fox News or wherever else they can, on Truth Social, wherever they can promulgate this and say, see what we're doing. We're going after the bad people who are here and taking your jobs and taking your housing and all of these sorts of things that they want to say. No basis in fact, but they say them, and they resonate with some people. Usually, this kind of scene is reserved for the most racist kinds of crime enforcement, where in the during the long years that we've had of the war on drugs, of arresting Black people in the quote unquote inner city, and displaying weapons and drugs for the public as a kind of spectacle. Well, this is going to be a human spectacle of deportation. And where there is resistance, especially if it is public, they will identify it and then point to those people as the actual enemies. Since we can't deport all the people we said that we wanted to because these people are resisting us, now we have to go after them. And how would they do that? With federal funding, with lawsuits, with potentially with deploy if they can make up a story about there being unrest in those blue cities and states that are resisting, potentially using the Insurrection Act and nationalizing their national guards, or sending a national guard from another state that has been nationalized, or sending the U.S. military or whoever else they can get to do this into those states to try to do enforcement activities if those areas are resisting. All of this again is about spectacle. Also, we can expect to see long-term long-term effect attacks on public good agencies. So we know that there's an agenda to abolish the Department of Education, but also to simply get rid of people who are ethical professionals serving in all of the federal agencies that do things like regulate banks or monitor clean air and water or monitor monopolies. And those being things that the various factions of the Trump administration the Trump regime would like to not see. They're going to generate chaos in those agencies with these thuggish and unqualified nominees to lead them, or the next round, which will be equally thuggish and unqualified, and then pivoting to from there to saying, oh, well, if they're not coming along, well, then let's defund them. Well, the president doesn't have that authority, but they're claiming, contrary to established law, that they can, quote unquote, impound spending if they don't think it's being used appropriately or efficiently or by whatever um, uh, uh, means they say. When you undermine all of those agencies that actually produce goods for people who live in this country, you're going to simultaneously undermine trust in the government itself, and it becomes a vicious circle of undermine the institution because it's not doing what it was set up to do. It is being, quote unquote, wasteful because it has no resources. It can't do what it was supposed to do because you've just attacked it and defunded it. And then come around again and say, well, either they're going to replace it with people who will do it Trump's way, or they will abolish it or make it into a moribund non-entity. This could have long-lasting impacts for us. And then it's going to empower the states, people in the states, to act with more impunity, to test the limits of constitutional restraint from the federal government around civil rights, around voting rights, around apportionment, around funding for the public good, funding for Medicaid, funding for infrastructure and education, and using that to try to control what happens in those states. It can create both disruption attempts by Trump sympathizers in blue states, as well as pushing the envelope in places like Texas and Florida and Tennessee. And there is potential resistance, not just from our movement world, not just from progressives and leftists and people committed to justice and democracy and liberation, but even from some of the institutional actors, if they don't feel like they are out on their own. These are typically people who have a propensity to know where their bread is buttered. And if they think they're going to fight and lose, they'll decline to fight. But if they think that there's significant pressure from civil society being put upon them to be better, they might, some of them, do it. And it will not take that many, because the margins are so small, of members of Congress and senators and judges and members of the bureaucracy to step out of line and say, I'm just not going to do this, and either resign or vote differently or organize their own constituencies to to try to fight against this effort to change the uh, basic norms of government, to make it worse when many of us see it as already pretty damn bad to begin with. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I want to um, pause so that we can engage you in questions. I want to ask the panelists if they have any questions for Stephen, and I want to bring in a question that has been raised in the chat. Stephen, you outlined a couple of different categories of folks: opportunists and grifters and true believers. Someone asks, where does Trump fit into those categories, or does it not matter? Is he head grifter? Is he a key ideologue? Or does it not matter where he fits?
He has no ideological consistency. He's an opportunist who ran for president again, first and foremost, because he didn't want to go to prison. And so being in office creates a certain kind of non-prosecutability as long as he is in office, and potentially more than that, given recent Supreme Court decisions. He has an affinity for policies and positions that are at base racist and exclusionary and misogynist. I mean, this is not a, if you look at his personal statements, this is not like any magic. But he doesn't have a deep ideological connection to those. It's more like they are part of who he is, in the same way that your racist uncle who you have to argue with at Thanksgiving is, as opposed to someone at a think tank at American Renaissance or Stephen Miller. But he has people like Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon, who's outside the administration, but still yelling at them from their own right, who are encouraging Trump and his cronies to be worse. And they're yelling louder than most everyone else consistently over the last few years.
Tenjiwe and Makani, do you have any questions for Stephen, or do you want to add anything to this kind of general framing that Stephen has provided?
I don't know if it adds, but I have some thoughts. One, I want to appreciate you, Stephen, for laying that out. Um, I am really sitting with Jean Hardesty in this moment, who some people remember was a founder of PRA and definitely a comrade and a mentor of mine. And I keep thinking a lot about two things she used to talk about. One was this sort of long-standing affiliation that the right would try to kind of force on progressives between, like, say, well, they're the people who are associated with welfare. They would associate whatever negative anti-Blackness and sensitive ideas with whatever progressive issues are, and kind of braid, right? The sort of welfare queen with the academics, and be like, don't listen to those people, don't pay attention to those people, just pay attention to us. Um, and and the organization over more than half a century, right, of organizing faith and organizing all of these markers of how people make sense of the world, right? To dramatically shift what Christianity is about. I mean, there are places where folks were definitely not in line with the revolutionary teachings about, where it began, where people are persecuted for it. But certainly the kind of overt pimping of the church as a place to sort of harbor these ideas. It's just like all these things in the creation of this sort of magaverse before it was a magaverse. And so I'm thinking a lot about Gene. I'm thinking a lot about Grover Norquist and his vision of basically setting things up so in his mind shrinking. He said he didn't want to abolish government. He would say he wanted to shrink it so he could drown it in a bathtub, right? And so here we are in the place where potentially the drowning in the bathtub opportunity is here. And the other thing I think about is I live in Mississippi where they're already practicing this. We're here. We're in the present moment of that. Um, and expecting worse. We've already experienced in 2018 mass deportations, which was like, I mean, it was crazy. People, they came and grabbed people, they left kids alone. Community had to really surround, and it was almost 1,000 people in one small area where poultry workers are. Now, most of those folks have been returned. It was for show, but it was devastating, even as spectacle. So many folks around the country, the places that are not in the media markets where folks even remember or pay attention to the devastation, we feel like we're here in the crosshairs. And then the other thing, and I know there's more to say later, I don't want to take up too much time, and I'm loving the chat, is I think it's also important to remember that we are really experiencing two different stories about what's happening right now. Um, if there's those people who maybe don't want to talk to that uncle or whatever that is, or you're in the Uber and the person is listening to Fox Radio and you want to throw up. But the truth of the matter is that people are having really different experiences. There are some folks who are coming in this with a great deal of hope, and they're overjoyed. And they have websites where you can submit your policy ideas. They're feeling like this is the first time that they're engaged in and what they feel like is going to be a huge democratic experiment, right? For the first time, they feel like this is going to be the first time their voices are heard as white people, which is ironic, right? But it is, but this is after decades, right, of storytelling and shifting and organizing institutions, including academia. The attack on radical thinking, like all of this is all of this together. This is like the meal has been prepared, right? They have been cooking, chopping, putting it all together, and then they have set a table. um and then the other thing, because I know we'll talk more about how to approach it and how to organize it. But one impact thing I want to really lift up that I think a lot of times we forget about is the impact that this shifting around government and government employees is going to have on Black women and Black families. Black women are overrepresented in the federal government as employees because it is a place where there is less racism. I'm going to say there's no racism, that there has been less racism around people getting hired, how they advance. And so there's a lot of Black, and if you have been like myself who've worked on the Hill, and that there really isn't a lot of things that you can do in DC on the Hill without knowing a Black woman who has a job that will know the thing. And many of those folks have been there literally for decades. And so you look at whole communities like Bowie and Laurel and Silver Spring in Maryland and in Virginia that will be completely decimated, and who hold on their benefits, just all of these things that that is highly likely because part of what they've done, as Jean has taught us, is associate government with Black women, associate government jobs with Black women, associate the idea of you having a job, whatever it is that you being on welfare if you have a public job, much less entitlements. So I want to also hold that sort of intersection around gender and race, and not that there aren't lots of other people who are affected, but there's a way in which the targeting of Black women and anti-Blackness and the patriarchy and the gender come together in a particular kind of way that will literally affect millions of people directly in terms of their material conditions.
Naomi, can I jump in?
Go ahead. Yeah.
First, I just want to say, um, it's a great honor just to be speaking along with Makani and Stephen, and it's kind of hard to be a third panelist with them because I can really sit here and just listen to them. I just wanted to build on something that Stephen mentioned, and what you asked Stephen just now was actually something I was going to ask him to build on, which is essentially what is this coalition? How is it made up of that is thrusting or helping to grow the popular base of MAGA, and then helping accelerate right-wing extremism. And Stephen, you talked about opportunists, true believers, grifters, and I think we need to spend so much time in really laying out the different factions of this coalition. I mean, when we talk about opportunists, obviously folks who see this as an opportunity to accumulate wealth. This is from those who are focused on cryptocurrency and sort of using technology as a means to accumulate wealth to scale, to, as you said, right-wing believers, that we cannot deny sort of right-wing extremists as sort of the resurgence of right-wing extremism, who are clear about an agenda where they didn't deny us of our dignity and our right to exist. So just wanted to appreciate that. The last piece I just also want to say is you talked about the spectacle, Stephen, and we've for years now been watching the spectacle of Trump, and the spectacle of Trump is dangerous, but we can't be so distracted with the spectacle that we lose sight that there's a political agenda that has been advancing for decades, that is accelerating this in this moment, and using right-wing extremism to grow its popular base.
Wow. And there's a lot of sort of co-signing and affirmation in the chat. You know, folk are saying the future is here already, just distributed differently, distributed, not all the way distributed. And examples of what Makani talked about in terms of the vulnerability of Black women and our communities in the wake of all of this. Tenji, I'm going to come back to you and ask you to help us get some clarity about how we should consider organizing and building movement under these conditions. What are the tactics we should employ to manage, for example, the security implications of this? And I think that there's a question also in the Q&A around how individuals can mobilize. If we're not affiliated with an organization or a group, what can individuals do?
Thanks. Thank you. First, I just want to say, I feel like as organizers, we have to engage this moment with a great level of humility. I find myself reflecting on what are the questions that I'm interrogating, because this is a profoundly important moment that we remind ourselves as organizers and as movement that our most powerful weapon is our ability to be humble, our ability to examine what do we need to do differently, while also being careful about the dangers of overcorrection. So much of what I'll share is things I'm considering, questions that I'm asking myself. And ultimately, I just want to say our movement's ability to be able to fight over this next period and build power will require a few things: a sober assessment of our weaknesses. We have to be honest with ourselves, our weaknesses in this current moment, as well as a clear understanding of what are the challenges that we face in this coming period, and what has led to the 2024 outcomes, and why we are seeing sort of the right wing's ability to further consolidate power and sort of what role is right-wing populism playing, and the consequence of the absence of us having a consolidated political force to challenge it in this moment. And so first, I just want to talk a little bit about the success of right-wing, some of the, I should say, the acceleration of right-wing populism. I have found, I want to be real and honest about what we see happening. And people keep saying was a landslide. No matter what your position is, what is true is that this in terms of the electoral outcomes was a decisive victory. Trump not only won the popular vote for the first time, he's the first Republican candidate to to do so in 2 decades. And so we have to be clear. We have to be clear and examine why. And also, for me, what I've been thinking a lot about is elections are critical, but they're also data. They as organizers, we have to. They're not going to tell us everything, and sometimes they're not going to tell us a lot of things. But we have to study it in ways to see what is it telling us, and how do we use it in order to build movement on our side. The other piece is, and I'm curious what others think about this, but also there are studies that are showing that the percentages of the U.S. population that sort of identify as MAGA is growing in this country. So at least like 4 studies that I've seen has clocked sort of the percentage of the population identifying as MAGA is between 10 to 15 million people, so around 51 million people. And so the question is why this is happening. One, I just want to say we can't attribute to this to a singular reason, which I've seen, and I'm curious if sometimes I've been guilty of. We can't be class reductionists and ignore sort of the role of white supremacist ideology, misogyny, transphobia, xenophobia that is strategically used and deployed by MAGA to grow its popular base and secure electoral victories. And in part, what we're seeing is a resurgence of an extremist movement that is committed to social hierarchy and believes that some of us don't deserve to live, technically don't deserve to live a life with dignity in this country, and the role that they're playing, and that they've existed throughout centuries, and while they've lied in some ways dormant for years, they were never dead, and this is sort of their political moment and awakening, as Stephen said, that they are a portion of this broader coalition. The other piece I do want to also say is what is also undeniable is that we have been in the midst of a crisis of legitimacy in this country. Increasingly, more and more people are frustrated with the political establishment, with the experience of living under the lie of trickle-down economics and the economic volatilities that neoliberalism has forced us into over the past 2 decades. So yes, people are feeling anxious, they're frustrated, they're being motivated by different anxieties, and they are allowing the scapegoating of entire communities as to justify why they are in the position that they are in. So ultimately, when we talk about sort of the role of the political establishment in the economy, I've been thinking a lot about how capitalism will always mean an economy that benefits some at the cost of many, and that neoliberalism, in particularly over the past few decades, particularly their policies, has accelerated crises for us that our people are experiencing. And these, as we've studied throughout history, but also globally, always help create political openings. Unfortunately, we are experiencing what the far right has done, which is uses political opening to usher in a political force called fascism. So there's so many things happening. And the thing I think a lot about, the thing that keeps me up, is that, like, let's be clear. This is about who's occupying the White House and the halls of government, which is crucial. But it's also about the fact that there's a growing popular support for the people, for these folks in office. And historically and around the world, fascism has relied on popular support to rise to power by mobilizing segments of the population through propaganda, mass movements, and appeals to identity, nationalism, and shared grievances. That this is something that we can understand and study throughout history, and it's also something that is happening around the world. So as movement and as organizers, the core of what we do is to organize people. That is our bread and butter. If we are not doing that, we have lost sight of who and what we are. Our objective in this period is, we have to tell our people the truth, and we have to make sure we're creating political homes, that we have enough political homes, that we're creating political homes for people. And there's different groups of people we need to organize in this moment. And we can't use the same tactic and strategy to organize them, because where they are in this moment is different, and what will engage and motivate them is different. But one group of people that I think a lot about is the millions and millions of people who are clear about the threat of this moment, who are not confused about the rise of authoritarianism or fascism, but that are clear, and they are confused. A lot of these are people who may not know about a webinar. These are people who may not be connected enough to an organization to know where to go to with their confusion, with their fear, with their anxiety. We have as movement, we have a political responsibility to reach the millions of people who are clear about the threat and who need to know, not only are we going to be committed to fighting back, but that they have a role within it. We have a responsibility to reach those people in mass. Simultaneously, we also have to fight like hell to stop MAGA from making inroads into our community. We can't lose more people over to MAGA or to right-wing populism. And so we have to develop strategies in order to engage millions of people in this moment. And for the people who understand the threat, we have to, there's so many things that can't happen, but we have to make clear that losing specific battles sharpen us. Losing battles is how you build warriors. Losing battles sometimes is what builds unstoppable movements. We have to be able to motivate and inspire our people to want to belong to a social movement, to fight back, to protect and defend, and then build our way out of this hellhole, while also fighting like hell to both undermine MAGA's efforts to make inroads in our communities, and then make sure that we're not losing any more of our people to right-wing extremism. In terms of like movement building and organizing this period, I'm just going to share a few things. And Naomi, feel free to cut me off if you need to. One, I just want to talk about is a posture. First, we need a posture of defiance and clarity. We can't mobilize people if we don't believe we can win. And I understand that this is a demoralizing moment for many, but demoralizing, if left alone too long, could be demobilizing. And so if we can't mobilize like we know that we can fight back and win, we can't mobilize our people in mass to do that. So some of that is a posture. Our people our people are, not only are our people deserving of a plan that can win, our people deserve to have leaders and movements that they can be confident in. And so again, how is moments like this sharpening us? How is it making warriors out of us? And how is it building unstoppable movements for our people? And understanding meaning what you have role is, it's time to roll up your sleeves, because we're to get into this moment and fight, and not just over the next several years, but over the long run. The second piece I just want to say on a posture is we have to tell our people the truth, and we have to give them a reason to believe in us. Messaging and how we talk to our people is so important, but it doesn't matter if they don't trust you. And so how are we building the trust and confidence from our people? The second point I just want to make is, like, we have to be willing to transform. We have to examine our strategies and organizational models that we've built to execute those strategies. We have to examine what'll work, what's been working and what has not been working, without overcorrecting. And so a fear that I have is sometimes when in moments like this, you could say nothing works, let's start over. Where the truth is, like, we have to be disciplined and discerning and thinking about what doesn't work, and be willing to be transformed, including the types of organizations we build. Because again, moments like this require humility, curiosity, and discipline. The next part I'll just say is, like, we have to be serious about power. I think over the course of decades, if we watch the proliferation of organizations and also the professionalization of movement work, we've confused popularity for power, and we've confused organizational reputation to building institutions that can make inroads to actually positioning our movement to govern. We have to be serious about power, which is something that is measured and that you do test over time. And essentially, it is about putting our people in a position so that we can actually govern. And so we have to think about that. The last piece, not the few more pieces I'll just say is like we have to protect and defend each other. The moments like this, because it's a pressure cooker, can move us into postures where we fight and divide. It is sometimes it's overt and sometimes it's very subtle. We have to be vigilant, not just with the overt threats to divide, to divide and fight. We have to also be very clear about the subtle ones. And so how are we creating a posture for protecting and defending each other? The truth is, like, we will not be able to take on every single challenge of this moment. And at the same time, if we are not clear that we have to build powerful strategies that can try to protect and defend the most vulnerable amongst us, then we will not just be able to create powerful movements, we will lose the confidence of our people. The couple other pieces I'll just say is around tactics. Courts and the law are going to be critical, but we should be mindful of calls to stand down in the streets. I think interrogating tactics we use, I think interrogating when we use it, the types of distributed actions that we use, when we deploy them are all critical. We should be willing and humble to interrogate all of it. But early calls to stand down in terms of organizing the streets should be treated, I think, with great suspicion. The other piece I'll just say is around inflection points. There will be inflection points in organizing opportunities in this next period. At the end of the day, there's so many things that happened out of MAGA, but there were promises made that will be broken. We know this. So how are we using those as inflection points? I'm talking about everything from cutting, like promises to cut taxes on overtime pay, to promises to cut taxes on tips, to commitments that the MAGA will be able to cut credit card interest by 10%. Broken promises are organizing opportunities for our side. And simultaneously, while those promises are being broken, we have to expose the fact that this was a wealth accumulation moment for a significant amount of the billionaire class, and in particular, 10 people in the billionaire class we know made $64 billion immediately after election. So how are we exposing that? I just want to end by saying this, that ultimately we need to do a number of things. We need to create essentially a path for the most immediate. But what is very clear is that we need a radical alternative in this country. The crisis of legitimacy is the failure of the current political system to meet sort of the demands of the day. And the failure of it is creating an appetite in this country for something radically different. We can allow the energy to be co-opted and captured by the right wing, or we can put forward a strategy to win, knowing it will take time if we are serious and have a real plan. But it's about breaking away from the two-party system. It's about governing. It's about building political forces like the Working Families Party. And it's about figuring out on the path to building that radical alternative, what are the things we need to concretely win in order to mitigate harms to our people and then slow down the rise of fascism in this country.
Wow, Tenji, thank you so much. I mean, there's some chatter in the chat about the 90 million or some odd people who did not vote in this election, and what you're saying about creating something compelling. I mean, I have an 18-year-old who just turned 18, and so this was her first time voting. And when we were talking about that move, she essentially asked us, her parents, is there something worth my vote? Right. She wanted to be compelled. She wanted to be convinced. She wanted to be inspired. She wanted to exercise her imagination. And so much of what I hear you saying is we on the left need to be more imaginative and strategic about what we're inviting people into, not just what we want them to fight against, but what are we inviting them into? I want to invite the other panelists to respond to or ask questions of Tenji. As you've been hearing what she's saying, as you've been reading the chat, would you add anything more about what we need to mobilize, how we need to mobilize in this moment?
Oh yeah, most definitely. One, I always appreciate Tinjiwe's brilliance, and it's always great to get to have conversations and be in her orbit. It's a wonderful thing. So a couple of things. So one is, I think it's important for people to ground themselves in history. And it's hard because a lot of the history of our organizing work is hidden. That is how this works, right? To hide the work, to hide our understanding. It's not institutionalized because we are not the people in power. And so, and there are a lot of lessons. One of the things I think a lot about is how we define power, and as Tinjiwe started to talk about, in really just narrow ways, and have a real lack of understanding. One of the things that I draw a lot of inspiration from are folks from here like Fannie Lou Hamer, who really understood power in all of its dimensions. Um, and so a lot of times people get caught up in how many votes they have in the House or all these other things. It's like, what is it that power is really? It's the ability, right, to make people pay, to create a cost if they do anything to you, where so hopefully so that they don't, right? To govern, to hold power, to be able to make the decisions that affect your life. Um, and because of that, a lot of times we don't really understand the architecture of democracy, right? So folks talk about parties, but you can't have multiple parties if you don't have proportional representation in ways that to make it meaningful. So there's a lot of work we have to do as organizers to understand democracy, to understand power, to understand the dimensions of power and how it works. And I feel that's a study, and I guess I've been thinking a lot about it because I'm writing a book that has some aspects of that. So I've been really thinking about that, looking at case studies, looking at information, interviewing people around organizing work that they've done in the past that people haven't really dissected, because part of the way the narrative works, even the ways in which our people get convinced to kind of move into things that seem like it's against their interests. The narrative is that it's magic, that our people are magic and we do these magical things and then we win. And then the sort of brass tacks of what it takes, that part isn't as visible, right? And with the so-called professionalization of organizing, even though many of the folks who we say weren't professional were way more professional, way more disciplined, way more clear, way more intentional, and wrote more things down than many of us do. That I feel like there's this need for us to kind of, yes, step back, think about power, but also think about where are the opportunities to cause pain, right? And then also, I'm also part of Tenjiwe is a part of this too, Black Narrative Table, where we have been really looking at um, mapping what is the sort of influence, how are people understanding, how they're making sense of the world around them, and through who, and who are the folks who are the guides, the influencers, the other pieces. And shout out to Reframe for their research and help in supporting this. And then I think what's been important for folks to understand is like what the right is doing is just pushing old buttons that have been built and already exist. There's a difference between pushing a button and getting people to sing a song they already know the words to, whether they agree or not, to teaching people new songs and new ways of doing things. That is a different kind of work. And we have to cut ourselves some slack around what that means. We have to do, and we also have to recognize that that is the work. It's not going to be about a counter narrative, right? And narrative power is not just about who has the most powerful story. It has little to do with that at all. It has to do with how we hold and control and capture the institutions of meaning making. And if we don't do that, you don't have narrative power and you don't have the other kinds of power. Other thing, and I talk about this a lot for folks who hear me talk a lot about this, and I apologize for the people who are going to hear this again, but you know, we also have to understand the difference between fringe strategies and mass strategies. We have to be at a place where we're understanding where is the point of leverage. And sometimes that point of leverage, like you look at what happened with Barclays in the UK around the Palestine question, that was just a few people who moved that. I'm not saying that we need to engage in those kind of tactics. What I'm saying is there are people who understand points of leverage. It does not have to be millions of people in the streets. It's good if it is at times, but we also have to be smart about power. We have to be smart about the economics of the landscape of where we are. And that is a different form of research than what this person says and what they think. And then it also gives us new alliances. Like where are the fault lines in capital? Because it's not just in terms of our people. Yes, I believe in an alternative that's working class led, that is clear, that is not only anti-racist, like all the things, right? I want that. I want to live that. I've spent my life fighting for that. And I also want to be smart about how we're organizing. I do, and I also want us to understand when we look at movements or times when movement has sort of risen to the top and we have had spaces where we are kind of the weather, right? We're determining what people are talking about and how people are moving and we're making change. That this was not necessarily one force, right? It was lots of forces. And so, how we hold that understanding in terms of the people who will move parallel with us, even if we don't hold them, even if they're not in a quote unquote political home, right? That's a lot of folks. One of one of the piece of writings that has really influenced me as an organizer, just most of my life, is the work of James Scott, and he talks about in his book Domination and the Arts of Resistance, he looks at like the moment where people rise up and what those things have in common. And and I have found this to be true. I mean, he looks at 1,000 years of it. And so there's a few things, and Tinjiwe talked about a few of them. One is that that we are naming the moment and people can recognize that, yep, that's what I'm experiencing. Yep, because people are what James Scott talks about in the hidden transcript is that people are talking all the time about how messed up things are, right? And they're experiencing it. And basically the first person who names like what you can do about it, then whether it's what we think or not, they're naming a thing. That's one part of it, naming what's happening, naming something concrete that can be done, being people perceiving you as trustworthy to do. That's one of, there's like seven. I won't go into all seven, but that's important. And that's one of the reasons why the corporate media goes after our movement leaders, our folks, because they understand the importance of people's trust in us. And then we have all these people who are survivors of movement heartbreak, uh, you know, and so like church heartbreak, right? Where they're like, I was in church, I ain't ever going back because of this. I was in movement, I'm never going back because I had this experience. And so we need to look at that, but we also need to understand there are external forces that attack us, that purposely undermine people's trust in us, and for us to look only internally at what is happening and say, well, we need to fix this and we need to fix that without a strategy around how we're attacked on the outside and people understanding our power. They attack us because they do understand how powerful we are. They do understand how sexy we are if given the opportunity, right? To be in, to engage with folks. And then the other piece that, like I said, I won't go into all seven components of it, but it's this idea that other that there is a possibility that we can work together, that we can keep moving together, which is the other story that they use. That the counter version of that story is what they use to also undermine movements, that movements are messy, that that if you get in there, they will break your heart. So there's the trust element, but there's also like, can we actually work together? And even though there are literally centuries of stories of multiracial alliance building, of beautiful work together that we have done and we have won, right? Because really the history of this country is slavery, right? Lack of suffrage for most of the people. Like that is the bulk of the history of this country. Most of the shit that happened, that fixed that, happened within the last 100 years, 150 max. So I think we need to understand that we're not a relatively new movement, but we're in a relatively new place in the history of this country. And so I feel like what this means is we also have to excavate these stories of how we worked well together. We have to excavate these stories about the fact that we have made a difference, because the history it's like the what unbearable, what no, the spotless, the eternal sunshine of the spotless mind. It's like our memory continues to be erased as movements, and then people come along acting like they have discovered a thing. And the last thing I'll say, because I know that we're running on time and I want to hear what Stephen has to say, is that the movements that we watch around the world that seem like suddenly they topple leaders or suddenly a thing happens, is that they were organizing workers in the public sector. They're organizing moms. They are seizing land. They are taking care of folks. They are holding multiple things at the same time. They're not like here in the States, like, oh, that's a direct service organization. We don't have nothing to do with them, or all those things. We can hold multiple things. We can be elite strike force that works a fringe strategy and organize a mass strategy. If we just understand that maybe we're a network, maybe we're a different formation, maybe we're a hive, maybe we're a swarm, maybe we're all those things, and I think a lot, Nikki Giovanni, who just passed, and when a shout out, she wrote a poem. I won't get into the poem. I just want you to Google it, called A Journey, that to me kind of sums up the way we need to roll. We are here together, but also here to work our stuff out. And part of what we are organizing people to do is to be leaders and to be responsible and to not look to us as folks to tell them what to do, but for us to be in this adventure together and to believe in the possibility, right? And that undermining of trust, that undermining of connection, which is the basic biological truth of who we are. We are connected as beings. And all that the right wing does all the time is to undermine that truth so then that we forget how to act and be with each other. And that our job in many ways is to remind people of our connection and remind people of their agency and remind people of the possibility that they can have a life of thriving, all of us together. That feels like the biggest part of our job. And I look forward to doing that with all of y'all.
Stephen, I want to invite you in. What do you have to say about how we mobilize in this moment? I mean, there's been a question raised about organizing in so-called progressive, so-called blue states where people think, oh, we'll be fine. They're not really clear, like Makani is in Mississippi, for example, about what's to come. What do you have to say to this question of how we mobilize?
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, I'm going to iterate something that Thenji said earlier. Really, I have to go after Makania and after Thenji and try to say something else. Maybe what I can do is a yes and, which is this. I actually practice improv, so maybe this is what I'm going to say. The right does not deny community. What it does is it founds their community on exclusion. It is There are certain people within the circle of empathy and a profound belief that if you try to extend it, you will break it. And then there are those of us who believe, as McConaughey was saying, that the extension of my empathy to more people does not diminish it, it expands it. The difference is actually fear. And this is what the right organizes around, a principle of fear, of those people will hurt me, those people are hurting me. And in a way, they're not wrong. It's just they have a profound propensity for identifying the wrong people who are hurting them. Um, uh, Even when it is completely implausible. It's not the billionaires who are profiting from their labor, from their votes, from their ways of living. It's the people who are even worse off than they are. This is strange but true. In terms of mobilizing, I don't really have much to add except for one point that I always try to make, which is we do need a broad, actually maybe two things, a broad coalition of people beyond the left. We're not enough. We're not going to win. We're going to lose. And I don't want to lose. I don't want to live in the world that the MAGA movement to the people that to their right want to make. It's already bad enough. Too bad, you know. So since I don't want to live in that world, I need a broader coalition. But in making that broader coalition, the sensitivity is to not throwing the most vulnerable people under the bus in order to make that that coalition. And also, we're just going to lose if we double down on, I mean, this word neoliberalism, it carries a lot of weight. And I'm going to say that really what it means is that people who have a lot deserve to have government protect what they have. People who have nothing or next to nothing deserve to work harder and die. That's what neoliberalism means. So if you wanted a succinct definition, that's mine. This is what the Democratic Party has stood for the last 30 or 40 years, at least, probably more than that, but that as well as expansionist foreign policy. And so if you wonder why people are not captivated by it, well, I mean, it's not very fucking captivating. On this issue of breaking out of this winner-take-all two-party system, there are some linchpins in here. Campaign finance is one of them. I mean, it was bad before Citizens United. Now it's impossible. This must change. Ideally, we would be able to split both the Democratic and the Republican parties, and so that we could end up with 5 MAGA, sort of ordinary business Republicans, center-right Democrats, progressive Democrats, and the left. That would be nice. I don't know how to do it, but am spending a lot of my time thinking about how we can go at this coalition, which is that is the MAGA movement, which is not just the ones that I talked about earlier, which are sort of the tactical orientation to this, but there's also the ideological orientation. And there's a division between the Christian nationalist, Christian theologists, the ethnic nationalists, although there's unfortunately increasing overlap, and the kind of business libertarian, just give me my crypto and my misogyny and I'll be fine, folks. But they are not, they don't all love each other. They have recognized that they all will benefit from a power orientations when they can place sanctions on the people they don't like, which are the people who believe in things like public education, universities, libraries, healthcare for all, civil rights, not being able to buy elections or gerrymander. I mean, the right at this point is so allergic to democracy that they believe that they are justified in gerrymandering far outside of anything that would ever have been allowed under the provisions of the strongest version of the Voting Rights Act. because they're right and we're wrong and we should die. I mean, to be blunt, Democrats gerrymander too. That's also anti-democracy, but it's also at least a small recognition of the kind of fight that we are in. Blue states, the complacency is idiotic. The threat to cut federal funding, which is largely coming from those blue states and going to the federal government, and that is now not going to come back if there's refusal to comply with mass deportation or getting rid of DEI and getting rid of basically many of the advances towards something that actually resembles democracy that have happened in the last 50 or 60 years are real, as are the potentials for adherence to the MAGA movement in state legislatures and in counties in places like California and Oregon, trying to go their own way. Deep blue states that have plenty of jurisdictions that are saying, we're going to refuse, and we will be empowered by this Trumpist administration. So this is the time to reinvest in your own democratic small d democracy in your state. For people who are saying, what can I do if I'm not part of an organization? Well, I mean, everyone's part of organizations. You don't have to join the Working Families Party or another activist organization of whatever kind. You're part of local civic organizations, educational institutions, families, where you can educate yourself and talk to people as a peer, as a trusted peer, and to stop people from falling for or make interventions in their life as a peer. This is one of the most effective things you can do as an individual if you're not deeply involved with organizing or in an organization. I would encourage everyone to be that, but not everyone is going to be. But everyone can speak from their heart and be willing to stand on principle and speak up. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. There's been a couple of questions or concerns made in the chat about how we can resist strategically at the scale and at the pace that our opposition is moving. What movement infrastructure do you think we need to scale up in this way? And what infrastructure needs to be created to keep our movement safe? There's also been a question about the risk of digital surveillance and just general security for our movement in this time. What infrastructural things do we need to create or evolve to meet this current moment at the scale that we need to meet it at?
I can try to jump in here. And I also had some other responses, so you feel free to stop me if you don't want me to go on. But I feel really honored that I've been able to work with PRA over the years. I find now more than ever, organizations need to figure out how are we working more closely with each other, and also there's so many different expertise out in movement, out in the field, whether it's cybersecurity, to folks who are researching trends in terms of far right and right wing extremists, to folks who are building sort of different types of support to provide legal support for leaders and organizations. And so I think now more than ever, it's like, how are we building infrastructure that can help organizations relate to folks who have an expertise, so that when folks are developing strategies, it's informed by that threat analysis, but also folks know where to go in moments of crisis and threat and challenge. And one of the formations that I've been working on with Stephen and Makani is Time to Act, where we've been trying to explore this question of infrastructure. But if it's okay, or you let me know if you want me to wait till later, so maybe other folks want to answer this question as well. I had some other points I wanted to share, so I'll be directed by you.
Okay. Any other thoughts about infrastructure that we need? And then I'll come back to Tenji.
Sure, be real quick, right? Because we are getting toward time. Um, so I, I, there's so much, but I want to figure out how to condense it. Um, so I think that there is, when we think about infrastructure, uh, I, a lot of times there's a lot of invisible infrastructure people forget about. And I was just actually just dropped something in the chat about, like early movement, like people said, oh, we didn't have foundation funding, but people had decent jobs and they would organize, you know, and use their job money to pay their salary, right? So there's all kinds of ways that people have thought about infrastructure, or buildings and land and spaces, and it may be that we will need sanctuary for folks in spaces to hold people and move people around. Um, so there's the infrastructure that's like the bricks and mortar, and like how do we hold our work, and how do we make sure that we have places to meet and people to make sure folks are moving things and all those things. There's infrastructure that's about our networks, right? Our relationships and being able to move together and being able to build together. There's the one of the places that I think we tend to forget is the infrastructure to learn and to relearn, because the only thing that you can absolutely bank on is that you're going to have to learn some new shit, and we need the capacity to do that and to help move that to defend and protect ourselves legally and otherwise. And that's important. And if you look at movements all over, including in this country and particularly in the South, that was something that was always built in, and it's become increasingly important again in these times. And then our narrative infrastructure, right? It's like, because what people believe, what are they hearing, how do they understand it, what they hear in church, how do we take that space back, right? And think about culture, right? And all of those things, that is infrastructure. In the old days people used to call it propaganda, but it's like, how do we capture and hold the mechanisms of meaning making, so that our people can hear the truth and also learn to think for themselves? That a big part of how this right wing piece works is by focusing on one little part of our brain, the amygdala, which is sort of the reactive fear brain. And then Democrats then try to do the same thing, where our job really is to help people develop the parts of their brains, those other parts, the parts around connection, the parts around having hope, like all of that. And so that infrastructure, in terms of how we help move that, how we take over schools, how we practice governing together, that's infrastructure. Because part of the struggle, and I say this living in Jackson, it's a real thing, not having the capacity to both hold the governance and do the organizing on the outside, because we don't have enough capacity, right? I mean, I'm just being real honest and vulnerable right here, right? And so that to have the infrastructure to be able to do that, the learning, the training, academic and otherwise, and to transform those academic spaces so that the people who come out of it, kindergarten on, have a sense of who they are in the world. So anyway, there's more, but y'all get it. That we need to have the infrastructure to weave some social fabric.
Before I invite Tenji to come back, I want to just throw out another one, perhaps final question for us to kind of ponder. Jasmine has said that as she organizes, she runs into folks who identify as leftists but reject the assertion that we have to contend for power in the administrative state specifically. So how can we move more people's attitudes in regards to the administrative state? Do you see realizing a progressive administrative state as a viable possible solution in this ocean of solutions you've been talking about? So I want to throw that question out there, throw it back to Tenji, who may not answer that question specifically, but has more to say.
Is that towards me, Makani?
I think so, baby.
Okay. Okay. You know, I just, and maybe I could just incorporate some of what I was going to say quickly. And I feel like this is maybe what I heard Stephen speaking to earlier, that the road to sort of the radical alternatives, if we're serious about it, it requires a few, and I think Makani spoke to this too. It requires a few things, but at the heart, it requires strategy. That strategy oftentimes is about mitigating harms in ways that don't undermine our power, but also how are we positioning ourselves to change specific rules so that we can create political openings to one day make viable alternatives happen. And then the third piece, and maybe this goes to like the struggle, that oftentimes also creating a path to the sort of radical alternatives we want takes specific strategic incremental changes. And oftentimes, because those incremental changes don't feel like leapfrogs of change, they are perceived as betrayals of our politics and of our people. And that for me is undermines our ability to get people to be clear about a winning strategy that over time is about reducing the suffering of our people and creating political openings for us to make a radical alternative happen. It's a matter of strategy. And I think we have to challenge our people into some of these debates and discussions and to be clear. And I just want to go to this piece that Makani said around power because it was so important to me. I think we have romanticized and have not always been grounded on how we understand power. And I think we've gotten captured with certain specific wins that leave current systems unchallenged and unchecked. And so we often talk about messages that are in the public discourse as opposed without also talking about, as Makani said, capturing institutions of meaning making. We sometimes talk about how many people are on our email list, how many people we can engage, how many people we can get out in the street without making an assessment of how much mass political homes and vehicles are able to not just absorb our people in mass, but move our people in mass over time. And so the question around to be disciplined and really think about how are we thinking about power over this long term, I feel like is so important. And I just want to say, focusing on power for me is helpful. It awakens a part of me that I need in this moment that can sometimes be frustrating and fearful because it forces me to not spend more time on how we lost than we are on figuring out a plan to win. And the last piece I just want to say is this crisis of legitimacy piece that I want to come back to. We have this like powerful opportunity within our movements to really earn and build the respect and trust of our people. And so we kind of have to really think about how are we in relationship to our people in ways in which our masses of people, sometimes I feel like in organizations we talk about the working class as if we're not of them, or we don't relate to our people in ways in which that like we are a part of them. We have an opportunity to demonstrate to our people how much we love them. That's everything from, and because Makani talked about direct service, we should be always in the practice of showing our people in various different ways that we deeply love, respect, and believe in our people so much so that we want to advance a strategy to win. So this is a moment where yes, we need to mobilize in the streets, but what other tactics are we thinking about in order to engage our people in mass and demonstrating that our movements is of and in service of our people. And the last thing I just want to say is, I think a lot about Frantz Fanon and this particular quote. I feel like I say like a broken record that each generation must discover its history, fulfill it, or betray it. And I say that because history is so humbling to me, and it reminds me that our people have not only survived, we have made interventions throughout history that have changed the course and the trajectory for decades to come. And so reminding ourselves that not only did our ancestors and our elders do it, we have a particular mandate in this moment to make sure that we're making interventions that generations from now will look back on and hopefully be grateful that we decide to make those decisions.
Wow. I think that sounds like a benediction to me. Those are some sending words, right? Thank you so much to this esteemed panel for sharing your brilliance and your wisdom with us. There's been a question in the chat about whether you all are on Blue Sky, how do people reach you? So if you want to take a minute to put in the chat that information, we'd really appreciate it. This has been, somebody just said, a gorgeous conversation, and I concur. Thank you so much for helping us interpret this moment, but also be inspired with some action steps we can take to build the resistance movement that we need in this season. So thank you so much. I want to remind you again that tomorrow, December 11th, Wednesday, at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, we will digitally hold Celebrating Tarso, where we show love to and respect to Tarso Luis Ramos, who has been the executive director of PRA and has been at PRA generally speaking for 18 years. And so you can register for that by clicking this link that I just put in the chat for Celebrating Tarso tomorrow at 5 p.m. Thank you all so much for coming. And this recording will go out. Give us about a week, and we will send you this recording so you can watch it again, so you can share it with your comrades. We are recording, and we hope that you will leverage this recording in your own networks. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the day.